Thankful again for this opportunity and this time to study with you. We've been looking for a couple of Sunday nights, an overview of the themes in the book of Revelation. We plan to conclude that study tonight. There may have been other themes we could have chosen, but I hope that this reminder has not been just maddening. Sometimes, an overview of a book as rich as the book of Revelation can be a little frustrating because you're not able to maybe dig into the reasons why or to deal with every question that people might naturally raise. We're not trying to do that. We're just looking at basic themes in the book. And tonight, I have to say, will likely be in that more familiar territory, more user-friendly part of the book of Revelation. As I want to think with you about 2 points tonight. And the first is simply this, that in the book of Revelation, we find this point made over and again, that God is demanding of His people. And I think about that expression where He tells the church, "Be thou faithful unto death." That's quite a thing. Be thou faithful unto death, even to the point of death. We live in an age where religion, if it's thought of at all, is thought of in very light terms. Men imagine a religion, a Christianity that doesn't cost them anything. And I don't think brethren are immune from that, by the way. There are plenty of folks I fear, the Lord knows, I don't know people's hearts. I have to struggle with my own heart. I wonder if there aren't people who think they just maybe coming most of the time and sitting on a pew is the extent of their Christianity. Give a few dollars on Sunday, and that's it. But I think that when you read the Scriptures, you get a real rude awakening about what God demands of us, how deep the commitment goes. And it's a deep commitment. And when you read the first 3 chapters of Revelation, you certainly get a sense of that, individually and collectively. One of the things that you learn when you read these first 3 chapters of Revelation, particularly chapters 2 and 3, is that just because you got Church of Christ on the front door doesn't mean it's so. There were congregations that the Lord deals with that were far from Him, though that would have been a surprise to them, the verdict of the Lord. Of course, this letter was written to 7 churches in Asia. And we certainly recognize that fact. We find letters from the Lord included in the first part of this letter, the Revelation as we call it. We talked about the symbolic nature of numbers. And, even the 7 churches, there's a symbolism, I think, involved with that. Not that there weren't 7 churches, but of course there were more than 7 churches in Asia. He could have mentioned Colossae. He could have mentioned Hierapolis. Those are churches we read about in the New Testament. So why 7? 7 in the Scriptures, 7 in Revelation in particular, has the idea of completeness. And it's been suggested, and this is, I think, plausible, that in addressing these 7 churches, the Lord is giving us more or less a complete picture of the state of congregations, of churches. And that we can, in a sense, find ourselves, whoever we are, in these 7 churches. Now, that may be so, but I think they're there to teach us. They're there to warn us. They're there to instruct us. The letters to these churches are good for this church and every other congregation of God's people. Something else that we notice in the symbolism. In chapter 1 and verse 12, I turned to see the voice that spake with me. And being turned, I saw 7, the old translation says 7 golden lampstands, or 7 golden candlesticks. Your translation may say 7 lampstands. Back in verse 20, the mystery of the 7 stars which thou sawest in my right hand and the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 churches. So here's the picture of these churches, as it were, lampstands. I think it's significant that he does not even picture local congregations as being 7 branches off of one central branch. That fits well what I believe to be the Bible picture of local churches. the idea of independence and autonomy in terms of their governments and their work. That congregations stand alone in reference to one another. There is no organic tie between this congregation and any other congregation. That congregations are independent, and I think that's no small thing. Each is responsible for holding up the light where they are. And something else we notice. In verse 13, we find this note about these 7 churches, that in the midst of the 7 candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the foot, and girt about the chest with a golden girdle or belt. So here's the picture of Christ. And where is He? He's right in the middle of these 7 churches. I think the point of that, of course, is He knows exactly what's going on. You know, you go and you travel and you visit places. Sometimes you're asked to go on a meeting, or you may be traveling on vacation and you worship with people and you see what you see. But we don't pretend that we know everything's going on in the church. We can see some good things, some things that look good, some things that might worry us just looking. But here's the point. The Lord knows all of it. He's right in the middle of it. And He's never fooled. He's never surprised. And that's true as much about North Bibb as it was about ancient Ephesus. You know, the Lord knows what's going on in this congregation. He knows every one of us. He knows our work together. It's good to remember that. You know, sometimes people think if I can fool Wes or whatever, I can get by. Well, fooling Wes is no big deal. May not be that hard. But fooling God is impossible. And so I need to recognize that fact. Now, when it comes to the idea of being demanding, one thing that we learn in these letters is that there certainly are threats to the church, and some of those come from without. For example, in chapter 2 and in verse 13, when he's talking to the church, writing to the church at Pergamos, he says, I know thy works where thou dwellest, even where Satan's seat is. And thou holdest fast my name, and hast not denied my faith, even in those days wherein Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was slain among you where Satan dwells. And so it talks about, Pergamos being in particular a place where Satan took up residence. I think that has to do with the heathenism, with the idol worship, and certainly the heathen were a threat to the church. It's also true that even, I see the book as being written in the late 1st century, still in the 1st century over in Asia, there were problems from the hostile Jews. Back in verse 9, when writing to the church at Smyrna, I know thy works, he writes, and thy tribulation, and thy poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them, which say they are Jews, but are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. And so I think from folks who claim to believe in Jehovah and folks who did not claim to know Jehovah, the church was pressed from without. I think it still is. I think there's still plenty of people who are looking to destroy, to mar, to ruin, to slander local works that are maybe not claiming any connection with Jehovah, some that do. But I notice this too, and you do too. When you read these letters, it's not just the problems without, but it's the threat from within that's a real threat to the church. For example, in chapter 2 and in verse 20, when writing to the church at Thyatira, the Lord writes, but I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and by her teaching deceives my servants to commit sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols. There were teachers in the congregations in the 1st century that were compromising, that were deceiving, that were convincing brethren that what was not okay was okay. In chapter 2 and verse 2, in praising Ephesus, one of the good things going on there, he said, I know your works and your labor, your patience, and that you cannot bear those who are evil, and have tested those who say they are apostles and are not, and have found themselves to be liars. Here's the point, that in the 1st century, churches were expected to stand for something. I think that spirit of compromise is alive and well today. There are individuals, there are preachers, there are churches that have made it their determination not to ruffle feathers. We don't want to make anybody upset. We don't want to look odd. We don't want to be criticized. And so they compromise the teaching. They tone down the teaching. One of the things that we know about the church in the first century when it pleased God is that it was not afraid to make known the will of God. When Paul wrote to Timothy, he said, I besought you to abide at Ephesus, that you might charge some that they teach no other doctrine. It's alarming to me that among young people, and those not so young, you find people who say we ought not argue about doctrine. Doctrine doesn't matter. I mean, the Protestants have said that for years in many cases. You know, just as long as you believe in Jesus, the rest of it doesn't matter. But, brethren, we ought to know better than that. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, later on in that same letter, he writes, these things I write to you, hoping to come to you shortly. But if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of the truth. Here is that which supports the truth, holds it up firmly and unwaveringly. We're not ashamed of the truth. When he writes to Timothy, that letter we call 2 Timothy, one of the things he challenges him with is not being ashamed of the truth. Be thou therefore not ashamed, he says, of the testimony of the Lord, nor of me his prisoner. I'm a prisoner. I'm a prisoner for the cause. I don't want you to be ashamed of me if I'm a prisoner for the truth. There's a great deal of pressure that's put upon people in our politically correct society. A lot of unpopular truths that people are sometimes shy about. To teach that Jesus is the only way. You mean Muslims are going to be lost? You mean these people? I'm saying anybody that's a sinner that does not know Christ and have the blood of Christ is lost. That's just as elementary as the ABCs if you read the Scriptures. It can be no other way. It's a fundamental truth. It's not popular. It never was. That homosexuality is not a virtue, not something to be proud of. It's a sin. It's a shame. It's a defect. And people who are struggling with that lust need to struggle, and they need to win over that lust. And they can. They can. God wants to save homosexuals as surely as He wants to save liars and drunks and fornicators of any other type. It's not a question of God's love, but it's a lie for me to believe that somehow people can be saved walking in sin. If there's anything the Scripture makes plain, it's that. And by the way, that's not a popular view. Why are you guys so small? You know, why is it that these churches not growing? Some of the churches are really growing. Well, maybe there are a lot of reasons for that. Maybe I'm too lazy or too thick to know how to do the work right. Maybe there may be all kinds of things that are my fault. But one thing I believe, that if you teach the New Testament truth, that's going to draw some people and it's going to repel a lot of other people. And we've just got to be willing to stand and take whatever brickbats come with that. To teach the marriage law, to teach the different roles of men and women, and that women preachers are not God's plan. And to teach the work of the church, and so on. Here, the point simply is that every one of us individually and every congregation is going to have to decide, are we going to be a pillar of the truth or are we going to be a weather vane? There are plenty of weather vane people in weather vane churches. And when the wind blows this way, that's the way they go. And when the wind blows back this way, that's the way they go. Don't be ashamed of the truth. And don't be ashamed of those who suffer for the truth. That's the message that I believe the Scripture would teach us. Be willing to suffer for the cause. God expects that of me and of you. Just one more example, and we could just go through the list here of the churches. A lot of excellent material here. But one more example I'll give, going back to chapter 3 and verse 1. When he writes to the church at Sardis, he says, to the angel of the church in Sardis, I know your deeds, that you have a reputation that you are alive. But in reality, he says, you are dead. That must have hurt. It would hurt if that was a letter to the church at North Bibb. How would you feel if the Lord wrote to us today and said, you know, you guys have a reputation, but really you're dead? That sends a chill down your spine, doesn't it? When he wrote to the church at Laodicea, he used different language, but I think it's a similar idea here. I know your deeds. He wrote that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were cold or hot. I wish that you had something, but because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I am going to vomit you out of my mouth. That's rough language. It's intended to be rough. Because you say, I am rich and have acquired great wealth and need nothing, but you do not realize that you are wretched and pitiful and poor and blind and naked. Again, every time I read this verse, doesn't it, and every time you read it, don't we feel that chill to say, God, help me not to be that self-deceived. These folks thought they were doing great. But the truth is, they were dead. Dead. Dead churches. Just holding services. Just keeping house for the Lord. Got the lights on. Have a meeting twice a year. We're doing great. Maybe these folks are doing the same thing. But the fire of God was missing. And the passion was missing. And the priority was missing. A church, to be what it ought to be, has to strive for excellence. I love that passage in Colossians 3:23. This is a modern speech translation. And it reads, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as though you were working for the Lord and not for people. The context here, he's talking about individuals working for other people. We've made this point before, I'm sure. I can't be certain this is true, but I read somewhere sometime, so that makes it so. That in the average workplace, usually about 80% of the work is done by about 20% of the people. I don't know. You think that's true? It could be true. It's true some places. And I'll tell you, if you're one of the 20% that are working, doing 80% of the work, that's not fun. You may work at a place where you see a lot of goofing off and a lot of people who are giving half-hearted effort, and here you are with a conscience. And here you are as a Christian. And what he tells them is, he says, you can't do that because you're not just working for them, you're working for the Lord. If that's true at a workplace, is that not true in the church? If it's true anywhere, it's true here. Everything we do here is for the Lord. That involves everything that we do. The service that we provide here, the worship that we offer here, when we're privileged to lead in service or lead in teaching a class, that the very best that we have is what we bring because we're doing this for God. And if we lose that spirit, if we lose that determination, then we're well on the road to being these churches we've read about. Just slopping along and, we're muddling through. Gabriel talked a little bit about that this morning, didn't he? Eat the Lord's Supper? That's right. Eat the Lord's Supper, we do that with our whole heart. By the way, when we sing, we do it with our whole heart. And when we pray, and as we attend, and as we give, and as we spread the message, and whatever service we do, if we're sweeping the floor, if we're getting the grass cut, whatever it is that we do, if we're helping our brother, our neighbor, in the name of Jesus, let us do it with our whole heart, no resentment, with our best effort. That, I think, is exactly what, with all your heart. Serve like you're serving the Lord, because you are. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15. This again is a modern translation of the passage there. Do your best to present yourself to God as an approved worker who has nothing to be ashamed of, handling the word of truth with precision. Do it right. Do it right because you think it's worth doing. when it comes to our work for the Lord, we do it right. We take on the responsibilities that we do, whatever they may be, with the idea in mind, we want to give our best to God. I think about that passage in Malachi. I think, again, this was brought up this morning in the lesson. We all remember this. It is so sad to me. The very last book of the Old Testament, after all they've been through, Malachi comes in there somewhere around 425, whatever it is. And you think about everything has happened to this point. I mean, they've been rejected at the border of Kadesh Barnea. They had the whole generation die off. They finally went in the land. They didn't clear the land. Then God sent the judges, period of trial there. They got a kingship. Then they lost it. Wound up going after the kingdom divided, going over into captivity for 70 years, coming back, making the mess that they made, and then Ezra and Nehemiah calling them back to God. After all of that, Malachi looks around and he says, you people are amazing at your ability to forget God and insult Him. You treat His word with contempt. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? I'll tell you what I'm talking about. Here's an example. You offer to God the lame and the blind. Offer that to your governor. See how that goes for you. You give God the leftovers, or worse. Exactly. And every time I read that passage, here's what I think. Have I ever done that? I've never offered an animal sacrifice in my life, but I've offered the fruit of my lips, giving thanks to God, as the Hebrew writer said. Did I just now mouth words that I didn't think about or didn't mean? Does my mind wander while we're praying together? Isn't that an important thing? Am I not serious about our opportunities to study together here? We have Bible classes. And the folks that we give the opportunity to teach those classes are supposed to be, and I pray are prepared for those classes. And I'm a student in that class, and I'm equally obligated to prepare and to come with an open, ready heart. Then I read this passage and I say, these people really are something, aren't they? They just gave all these blind animals. And the Lord's looking at me thinking, yeah, you ought to know how that feels. He knows how it feels. God forbid, God forbid. So, God is demanding. He says, serve me with your whole heart, serve me every day, serve me whatever it costs, serve me if it kills you. And he says it and doesn't bat an eye. He means it. So when I read this book, don't you get a real sense of God's demanding nature? We read the parable of the talents. The fellow who was given 1 talent, he comes to the Lord and he says, his master, and he says, I knew you're a hard man. And the Lord said, if you knew that, you should have done a lot better than you did. I am demanding. I expect a lot. If I give you something, I expect something in return. No blessing is offered to me or to you or anybody else without the expectation of using that for God. And there are people that live their whole life and they never think about God. People in this room are certainly better than that. We've made promises, but whether I keep those promises, when I walk out of this building, tomorrow when I have to deal with the work, maybe not, I don't know. Mike was reminding me tomorrow's a holiday and I don't know anything. But anyway, whenever we go back to work and the world hits us in the face and we've got to take a stand for God, will we do it? God says, I expect you to. But there's something else, and this is what I want to close with in the book of Revelation, that I think is the other side of that same coin, because God is demanding, but God is also giving. You can't outgive God. You just can't outgive God. And I think about that passage that we referred to earlier when he wrote to Smyrna. He said, be thou faithful unto death. But what's the rest of that sentence? You know it. And I will give thee the crown of life. Never think that we can outgive God. And I love this last expression down there in verse 11. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith to the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. He that overcometh. I will give thee a crown of life is coupled with that idea of being an overcomer. This word overcome, again, people sometimes maybe don't get a lot out of the studies of the words, but this word is a fascinating word. The Bible's written in words, and this is a great word. The root word of this nikeo, the verb here, is nike. N-I-K-E, we would transliterate it. What does that sound like? You may have that on your on some T-shirt you got at home or some sweatshirt. The shoe company borrowed that. They didn't borrow it so much from the Bible as they did from the Greeks. The Greeks, that was their word for the one who is the victor. Victory in particular. It goes back to a Greek goddess, I think, who also was given that name. But when it's used in the Scriptures, it's not used of a shoe company and it's not used of a Greek goddess. It's used of the picture of ultimate victory. My belief is, and there's some smart folks who seem to disagree about this. I heard a good brother the other day, a fellow that I appreciate, and he was reading a passage and suggesting that maybe some of these verses we're going to be looking at were applying to us now. I don't believe so. I think when he talked, I think there are a lot of blessings that we have now, and we have victories that we're fighting now. And maybe you fought one today. Maybe you fought one yesterday, and you came out on top by the grace of God. But I don't think that's what he means when he says, he that overcometh. It's not the daily victory that we're striving for. This pictures the ultimate victory, when the fighting is done. When the final victory is had. That's the way this word is used. In the letters to the churches, this is repeatedly so. Chapter 2 and verse 7, to him that overcomes will I give to eat of the tree of life which is in the midst of the paradise of God. I believe this pictures for us that final reward. Been said a lot of times, and people who may not be as familiar as you are with the Scriptures might find this to be surprising. But here you have a book written over 1,600 years by some 40 different authors from different places in the world, put together by the providence of God, and yet it's not disjointed at all. It tells one story. It tells the story of God and man and sin and redemption. It starts with man's sin separating him from the tree of life, and it ends with the man Jesus Christ making it possible for us to again have access to the tree of life. Not in this world, but in victory. And that's what he's talking about here. In Revelation chapter 2 and verse 11, he who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. You keep reading, you look over in chapter 20, verse 14, you find out what the second death is. I think the first death is when our body and spirit are separated. It's appointed to men once to die. But in chapter 20 and verse 14, he talks about another separation, an eternal separation. When he talks about those who are cast into the lake of fire, which is the second death. This is the idea of being eternally separated from God. His point is, those who overcome, that's the opposite of the second death. That no longer is a danger to us as we have won the victory. Or in chapter 3 and verse 5, he that overcomes shall be clothed in white garments, and I will not blot his name out of the book of life, but will confess his name before my Father and before the angels. That God will claim us as his own. Our name written in that book of life, not to be blotted out. In chapter 3 and verse 12, he that overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. He shall not go out anymore. This is not a temporary post. This is our place. This is our security, to be a pillar in the temple of God. That's for the one that, not one that's fighting the battle. That's his hope. This is for the one that overcomes. Finally, in verse 21, to Him that overcomes will I grant to sit with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat down with my Father on His throne. That to me makes it crystal clear. He's comparing whatever he means by overcome with Jesus overcoming. It is finished. And for us one day, when the race is run, it is finished. That's what Paul was talking about as he closed out that letter to Timothy. I have fought the good fight. I've finished the course. He was a short time away from death. And then his race was run. And there's laid up for him a crown of righteousness. One of the great themes of Revelation is the ultimate victory of God's followers. This is the hope we have during the difficult times, that there is something better, and the God that we serve never forgets. You know, that kind of language is found especially in the last part of, in the first and in the last part of Revelation. There's a battle in between, but for example, in Revelation chapter 21, we find, again, what I believe to be a description of the reward for those who overcome. Not of the church now, but of that reward when the battle is over and when the reward of God is given. And you find language like this in verse 11 of 21. Her brilliance sparkled like a very precious jewel, or a diamond, as somebody suggested, with the clear light of crystal. The city was of purest gold with the brilliance of glass. The 12 gates were 12 pearls. Each gate was made of a single pearl. And I've admitted this before. I hope you don't find this irreverent. I don't mean it to be. I have to tell you, I don't know much about pearls. I don't know that much about diamonds. I've never been drawn to jewelry. And frankly, I don't find gold that beautiful. So for a bumpkin like me, sometimes this language maybe isn't, maybe it doesn't strike me as it ought to. And that's my defect, I suppose. But if you happen to be like me, I'll offer this thought that's sort of helped me through the years. I think what John is doing is he's clearly not talking about a material kingdom. These are symbols. What are they symbols of? They're symbols from life, this life, that are designed to try to give us a glimpse of what that realm will be. It's something that John wrote. I think, again, Gabriel probably mentioned this the other day in a lesson from John. In 1 John chapter 3, John writes in verse 2, Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be. But we know that when He shall appear, we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is. And I take it to mean until then, frankly, we won't fully be able to grasp the glory of the resurrection body. So I just come to this with the idea in mind that I can only get a glimpse. But John in Revelation, by inspiration, pictures for us a city in terms of fabulous precious metals and jewels. Things that we can see in this world are meant to give us a glimpse of what heaven is like. I always think about that story. I may have told you this before at some point, about this lady who was trying to teach a handicapped child about what a deaf child, what a tornado sounded like. I think that's what it was. And so, the child asked that question about what does a tornado sound like, and signed to the deaf child, well, it's like a train. And then, of course, what came back? What does a train sound like? And I think that's sort of what God's doing for us, is He's trying to explain to me, limited as I am, about a realm that's beyond really maybe my ability to grasp in full. And so we've said before, when Peter writes in 1 Peter about heaven, he writes about heaven in terms of what it's not. It's not corruptible, and it's not defiled. It doesn't fade away. And here John writes and he says, well, it's sort of like a jeweled city of gold. Maybe this will help you. I don't know. It helps me. I think about other things that God has made that are beautiful. I'm not asking you to answer out, but if you think in your mind about some of the most beautiful sights you've ever had, we might say our children when they were born, or what, okay, but maybe it's some natural sight. What might come to your mind? Well, just, I don't know. You've been places I haven't been. Maybe I've been a place or two you haven't. I've seen some mountains that take your breath away. I've seen some sunrises and sunsets. You know, some of you guys like to hunt. I'm sure you've had that experience. Out in the woods, you know, before daylight, and then that day breaks, and it just the colors of the sky, it's just a marvel. I feel a little bit like that. Every once in a while I meet somebody, this is neither here nor there, but I meet somebody who is, they like to hike. And they'll try to tell me, oh man, if you take this 20-mile hike straight uphill to the top of this mountain, you can see the sunrise. And I hate to tell them, I say, I can see the sunrise where I am. Sunrise is everywhere. I believe I'll just stay where I'm at, thank you. I've seen some on the ground, pretty good. And I wonder why that is. I wonder why God made the sun rise like that. Why He made the mountains like that. Why He made the clouds like that. Why He made the sun like He did, or the moon like He did. He could have made it sort of bland, couldn't He? Could have made everything black and white. I think God gave us beauty for a reason. And I suspect it is because it gives us a glimpse of what God can do. A glimpse of what He can do when He makes a place beautiful. And I suspect that heaven is one of those places that ultimately, when we get there, we will say, we took the hints, we read the words, but there are just no words that can truly explain this place. I tell you, we know enough to know, I want to find out. I don't want to miss that. I don't want you to miss that, by the way. In 21, you know, there's several expressions here we'll have to cover very briefly here. The tabernacle of God was with men. I think this is that final union. And He will dwell with them, and God Himself will be with them and be their God. What a glorious thought that is. You know, all of our contact with God has been through the veil at this point. I believe God is really with us. I believe He hears us. I believe He indwells us. But it's not visible. It's not sensible in that context. But there comes a place in verse 22 of chapter 21, I didn't put this on the chart, but I saw no temple therein, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb of the temple up. You know, there is no barrier, but we see God as He is. And we experience His presence in a way we have never experienced it before. We cannot experience it now. And I think that's worth everything. And he goes on to this same context, talk about how God will wipe away all tears from their eyes. No more death, sorrow, crying. No more pain. I'm sure you feel the same way. I'm so sick of going to funerals. I'm so tired of that. I'm so tired of people that I love dying, suffering. And I know you are too. And God says, well, let me tell you, that's all temporary. There's a place where there won't be any more of that. Hold fast. Trust me, it'll be worth it. Trust me. Pay whatever price you have to. Right, for these words are true and faithful. That's a great way to end that paragraph, isn't it? You know, he's saying, you can trust me when I tell you. Because only God knows. There's a whole cottage industry of people who claim to have died and then come back and write about it. The near-death experience people. You know, you've read or you've heard about at least some of those books. I'm not saying they're all liars, but I don't believe any of them. I believe they may have experienced something. As I've said before, when you cut the oxygen off to a fellow's brain, he's liable to see a lot of things. All kind of pink elephants and whatever else his imagination may come up with. I'm not saying he's not being truthful. But when you read after those fellows, they've got all kind of ideas that are not biblical about what comes next. My point is, for you and I'm not waiting on somebody to die and come back and tell me. I've got what I need from God, and this is faithful and true, and I can count on His promises. Let me look quickly at a line or two from chapter 22. In the same context, he continues, He showed me a pure river of water of life. You know, we have said before, we take water for granted in our society. We don't even have to draw it anymore. We don't have to boil it to purify it, at least not normally. But you can't live without water. And there's hardly anything that satisfies like water. Water is essential, it's satisfying, it's sustaining. And heaven is pictured as the great fount, where every need is met and all suffering is alleviated, pure, clean, refreshing. That's heaven. The tree of life is there. We talked about that a moment ago. And the leaves of the tree for the healing of the nations. No more curse. Again, I know people. You know people. You may be one of them that are suffering, that are struggling, that are carrying scars and wounds and just dealing with it and getting through by the power of God. There is a place where all of that will be healed. I don't know how all it's going to happen, but I believe Him when He tells me that. No more scars. All the effects of the curse are gone in this place for those who have overcome. And His servant shall serve Him. Again, I think it was mentioned this morning that one of the silliest things you will hear as people discuss heaven is whether or not it will be boring. And I think, there are many things to be concerned about. That's not one of them. Because, everybody's sitting around on clouds playing harps. Who wants to do that for eternity? And I've said before, if that's the way if you're not ready to handle books for adults, just leave them on the table. Don't be picking them up and coming up with ideas like that. When you read the Scriptures, it's one of the interesting things that there is the promise that in heaven we will be servants, that we will serve there. People say, well, I thought we were called to rest. Well, we are. Heaven is a rest. Hebrews 4:9 tells us that. There remains yet a rest for the people of God. But rest is not inactivity, as God describes it. There's no servile work. The drudgery is gone. But what is there is work that provides purpose and joy and place and fulfillment and satisfaction. Look in chapter 7 of Revelation. In chapter 7 and in verse 9. After this I behold a great multitude that no man could number, of all nations, kindred. They stood before the throne, before the Lamb, clothed with white robe, palms in their hand. I think these are people that are overcome. And cried with a loud voice, saying, Salvation to our God. And they worshiped the Lord there. These are people who have overcome. Who are they? Verse 14. These are they which came out of great tribulation, and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore they are before the throne and serve Him day and night. What kind of service? I don't know. I know this is referred to several times. I'm turning back now to Matthew chapter 25. In Matthew 25, in that parable of the talents that we were talking about, you're so familiar with. You remember at one point in verse 20 of Matthew 25, so he that had received the 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents. Verse 21, the Lord said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Isn't that the same point? That when we are called into account and our time here is done, God said, well done, I've got greater work for you. I heard a fellow one time make the point that when God worked with Joseph, think about what He did. He took Joseph as a faithful son and taught him how to be a faithful slave. And then taught him how to run a prison. And then taught him how to run Egypt. And you can see God bringing along His servants for greater and greater work and service. I don't know what God has in mind for you, but I promise you, it will not be a drudgery. It will be a joy. It will be a thrill. It will be a glory. He doesn't take us from something good and turn it into bad. He takes us from this place and makes us more glorious, more useful, more fulfilled. That's a great thought to me. And they shall see His face again. No night there. No night there. The Lord God gives them light, and they shall reign forever and ever. Don't you think about that old song? Often I am hindered on my way, burden so heavy I almost fall. Then I hear Jesus sweetly say, heaven will surely be worth it all. I think the book of Revelation teaches that lesson. Let me offer this one final thought. You know, we looked, I think maybe it was the last lesson, about that story of the marriage of the Lamb. I don't know if we made the point, we meant to anyway, that when you think about the marriage of the Lamb, in a sense we are married to Christ now, but it's more of a betrothal marriage. But there is a time coming when the consummation will take place, when all of the distance will be gone, and that fellowship with Christ will be the most intimate and glorious. And that's what I think chapter 19 is referring to. Look with me back in 19 and in verse 7. Let us be glad and rejoice and give honor to Him, for the marriage of the Lamb is come, and His wife hath made herself ready. Notice that. Here is a wife that has made herself ready for this great marriage day, this union with her Lord. And to her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white. For the fine linen is the righteousness of the saints. And he says, blessed are they that are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he saith, these are the true sayings of God. I believe this is pointing to the time when we overcome, when all of the trials are over. In chapter 21 and in verse 2, that we have on the chart here, then I saw New Jerusalem, the holy city, coming down from God in heaven. It was like a bride dressed with her wedding gown, ready to meet her husband. That's what it's all about. But here's the danger. We looked in a previous lesson also in chapter 17. And we see one of the guises of Satan's work as a harlot with a cup, a golden cup filled with filthiness and fornication. Spiritual fornication. Riding upon a scarlet-covered beast. Chapter 17 in verse 1 reads, I will show you the judgment of the great whore that sits upon many waters. Verse 2, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. You keep reading down in chapter 18 and in verse 4. And the voice cries out, come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, that ye receive not of her plagues. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. Somebody made this point. It's been made many times, I'm sure. But here's the challenge. You know, while we say we want that marriage feast of the Lamb, we want to be the bride of Christ. Whether we're worthy of that depends on whether or not we sell out to the harlot now. One fellow put it this way. He said, every Christian wants to be at the marriage supper of the Lamb. Are you willing to live like the bride? Exactly. And that's a great point, I think, to end on. The book of Revelation basically ends on that point. Revelation chapter 22 and verse 14. Blessed are they that do His commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter in through the gates into the city. For without, shut out, eternally without, are the dogs and sorcerers and whoremongers and murderers and idolaters and whosoever loveth and maketh a lie. I, Jesus, have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things in the churches. I am the offspring of David, of the bride and morning star, the root of the offspring of David, I should have said, and the bride and morning star. And the spirit of the bride say, come. And let him that heareth say, come. And let him that is athirst, come. And whosoever will, let him take of the water of life freely. We've tried in these 3 lessons really to look at 4 themes in Revelation. One is that God is at work in this world. I believe He was then. And Christians who were suffering and struggling and tempted to be worried and concerned and hopeless about the world's circumstance, God is working His plan in the world. That's great news for me today. Another point he made is that God is greater than all His enemies. I don't care how tall the beast of the sea or the beast of the earth or the harlot riding on, I don't care how tall they look. I don't care how tall the dragon behind it all looks. God is greater. And they're going to lose. God is demanding of His people, be thou faithful unto death, but He's also rewarding, and I will give thee the crown of life. He tells me all this so that I can make a good choice. And the choice is now. The choice is today. His call is to follow Him, trust Him, live for Him, and live with Him in a place beyond the troubles of this life. There's not a greater offer than that. If you haven't accepted that, hope you will today. If we've lost our way, hope we'll come back to Him right now, today. Even while we stand and sing, will you come? Hark the gentle voice of Jesus.